little unnerved. Good Shabbos. Thanks. Early on in my career, I remember somebody coming up to me after services one day and said, she was saying, Rabbi, nobody comes, the young people don't come to services anymore. They never come. And it was early in my tenure there, and she kept telling me how sad it made her over and over again. And I commiserated with her. My kids would come, and they were sometimes the only kids in the sanctuary. And then through a lot of work and different programs and different things that happened, I remember one day it wasn't even a bar bat mitzvah, we just had a ton of kids in the services. And I was so happy. They were singing, they were doing Aleinu, they were going up and down and doing the whole thing. And they were Ruach, there was all these things. And I remember services ended and you know, I looked for her. She was a regular. I looked for her at Kiddush, and she looked at me and she saw me across the room and she made a beeline for me. And she comes right up to me. She goes, Rabbi, there were so many kids in shul. And I said, yes, there were so many kids in shul, and they were wearing jeans. I didn't know. It was like somebody took the wind out of my sails. It was like being punched in the stomach. Awesome. This week, we read a very famous story. And just when you think that we're very different as Jews, because we come off of a holiday where we sit in huts, and we are different in that way, we tell the story about the flood. And you may or may not know this, but almost every major religion has a flood story. And early on in the Parsha, it says, Vatimaleh haaretz chamas, and the world was filled with violence. And the full sentence is, God saw that the world was full of violence. And the altar of Kelm, of Kelm, the wise men of Kelm is a different thing, but the altar of Kelm said, the reason the verse says that God saw that the earth was filled with violence is because nobody else did. And I just love that. And so we know the story. God says to Noah, I'm going to flood the earth. I'm going to destroy it. Everybody's going to die except you. And Noah's response is, cool. All right. I'll build an ark. I'll save my hide. There are two kinds of tzaddikim, of righteous people. One is they share the certain attributes of obedience, of righteousness, of zealousness. But here's the difference between the two of them. One does it alone, that's Noah, and the other brings people along, right? Very often, and every bar mitzvah kid that has Noah as a bar mitzvah portion, I've heard the same speech every year for a long time, right? Who does Noah always get contrasted with? Abraham, right? It says that God walked with Noah, but God walked in front of Abraham. Noah acted alone, and Abraham brought all of these people with him. He brought people to Judaism. He brought people to a new path. And so Noah was a righteous man in his time. But he acted alone. There was no gunman on the grassy knoll. He acted alone. And Abraham brought people together. And the rabbis go so far as to say that Noah was punished for this. And his punishment was being reincarnated as Moshe, to show how to do it properly, to bring people out. That was his tikkun, his repair that he had to do. I was listening to a high holiday sermon by Rabbi David Wolpe from Sinai Temple in LA, and he was talking about this. He was talking about identity, right? And identity is all over the place. Identity politics, right? We are this, we are that. And he talked about it in contrast with Rosh Hashanah. How do we celebrate? What is the story we tell on Rosh Hashanah? Hayom Harat Olam. Today the earth was created. For Judaism to celebrate the new year We very easily could have started with the story of Abraham and the beginning of Judaism, but we didn't. We started with a universal story, with a story that is about all people and not about particularism. And Rabbi Wolpe says it's because principle is more important than identity. And I loved that idea, that what unites us is principle, not identity, and that principle is more important. And so we look at Moshe, and we look at Noah, and we look at Avraham as these two examples of people who do different things. One has identity behind it. I'm going to save mine, my tribe, my clan. The other is, I'm going to bring everybody together. And it's easy to judge Noah for what he did and say, well, I'm not a particularist like that. I'm a universalist. I believe in interfaith dialogue and all of these different things, and that's important and that's great. But then it comes down to maybe not the universalism we're ready for. I've posed this question to many different people over my time. We all know the numbers in Judaism. We all know the numbers specifically in conservative Judaism. And if you don't know them, that's okay. This is my job. I spend my time doing this. I got news for you. It's not good news. So the question is, do we want what we have to continue? Or do we want something more for the next generation? Is it more important for us that Judaism looks the way it has looked for us and our comfort, or if the next generation changes it? I'm not here to answer that question for you. That's something we've got to decide. For some people, I made the joke about the jeans story. But for some people, that's a big deal. For some people, seeing somebody in jeans on Shabbos morning is visceral for them. It's because they're used to going to shul in a suit. Now you notice, I don't work there anymore. I don't like wearing suits every Shabbos. But the question for all of us is, we want to build that ark. We want to save Judaism. But do we allow people to build it with us? Do we allow people to change what that ark looks like? To change what we have for the next 40 years or 100 years or whatever? Or are we interested in preserving it the way it's always been? Clearly, in the way that I'm telling this story and this sermon, I have an opinion. I think it's Avraham and not Noah. I think Judaism, as we've grown up with it, worked right up until the point where it didn't. And in a very large way, the Judaism we have is not our own. Yes, we have certain things, we have instruments, we have egalitarianism. But in a very large way, the shul, the way a shul is run, the way services are run, is the same way it was run for our grandparents in shtetls and in Chelm and in Kelm and in Warsaw and in Praga and in all these different places. Do we want to preserve that? Do we want to sit in shul and remember our grandparents? Or do we want to sit in shul and see our grandchildren? It's a choice we're going to have to decide. So all of these numbers for conservative Judaism I mentioned aren't great. In fact, when the Pew report, right, or some rabbis call it the PU report, right, when it came out, a former conservative rabbi named Rabbi Daniel Gordis wrote a piece called A Requiem for a Movement, saying conservative movement's done. You know, it's a really good thing he wasn't around 2,000 years ago, because he would have written a requiem for Judaism. Because 2,000 years ago, what happened? It's not a rhetorical question. What happened? The temple was destroyed, and everything we knew about Judaism was gone. Think about it. Priests run the services. The services are sacrifices. They're based in Jerusalem. It's the only place you were allowed to bring a sacrifice. And it was gone. It couldn't continue. And 70 years after that destruction of the temple, the rabbis got together and said, the Judaism we had needs to look different for this time. We're in a diaspora. So from priests, we went to rabbis. From sacrifices, we went to prayer. From Jerusalem, we went to everywhere. But we kept the principles. As I mentioned, we're still doing the Judaism of our grandparents. And now, we're more than 70 years after the last destruction of the Jewish people. And the question is, what do we keep and what do we change so that Judaism survives for another 2 millennia? These are the questions we're going to wrestle with together. We're going to build this ark, we're going to agree, and guess what? We're Jews. We're going to disagree. And we're going to build an ark together. And we're going to make sure that 3 kids becomes 6 kids, becomes 12, becomes, I'm not great at math, but keep going, 24, 48, right? That's about my, and whether they're wearing jeans or not, my hope and my prayer is that they're here with us, that we can grow together. Shabbat Shalom. We continue our service.